leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Well, maybe right now we're hearing not very much about defence, a bit of a row going on between Gavin Williamson, the Defence Secretary, and Mrs May. But I predict that within the next couple of weeks, this is going to be a very, very big issue. Donald Trump is coming to town, and his first visit is going to be to Brussels, and it'll be on July the 11th. That will be a NATO summit. NATO, which of course has been around since the late 1940s and has been seen as the guarantor of our protection. There are 29 members of NATO. Only about a handful now pay 2% of their annual spending on defence, and there are some who think that actually our 2% isn't genuine because we add all sorts of things into that figure. And Trump is saying, hey, we're spending nearly double that on defence. We're picking up the lion's share of NATO. This simply can't go on. And all of that against the backdrop of Mr Juncker and co trying to build their own European army and arguing that 1% is probably enough. So defence is going to be a very, very big issue. And yesterday was Armed Forces Day. And Mrs May was asked about this. She visited Llandudno, which was where Armed Forces Day was being celebrated. And she said that we will continue to be a leading military power, that we have the biggest defence budget in Europe. Well, all of that is true. But is she committing to us being a tier one player? And does it matter? Does it matter that at the time of the Falklands War, we had 327,000 people in the armed forces, and that now that is 150,000? Does it matter that in 1982 we had 900 tanks, we've now got 227? Does it matter that we had 60 warships in 1982 and that we now have 19? Is this an issue that voters care about, or is it an issue that actually politicians can ignore and they can continue to relatively run down our military thinking it won't matter? Well, look, I care a lot about this. I think it matters hugely. I also think that with Brexit Britain, here is our chance to really establish ourselves as a major player in the world, and we should be the broker between America and the rest of Europe in an attempt to try and get NATO to survive. Whatever you think of Donald Trump, actually, his criticisms about the rest not paying their fair share strike me as being absolutely right and fair. So, does defence matter to you as an issue? Call me on 0345 60 60 973. You can text to 84850. And I'm going to go and ask Admiral Chris Parry, former NATO commander and former Director General at the Ministry of Defence, what he thinks is going on here. Chris, good morning to you.
Good morning.
So there is a bit of a battle going on between, is this Defence Secretary actually standing up for the military properly?
Well, I think he's going through the motions. There's no doubt about that. How he'll cope when he comes up against the Treasury, I don't really know. But I think part of what you said just now is absolutely right. The Trump administration has actually called time on the freeloading by the European nations on NATO in the past. We have a country that, in sustaining the international rules-based system, America, is spending nearly 75% in support of NATO. And that, I'm afraid, is a can that has been kicked down the road for far too long. Hard decisions haven't been made, and the Europeans have got to stump up. There's no question about that.
And yet Mr Juncker, the European Commission boss, says, oh, no, we're going to build a European army, and because of economies of scale, we can get away with spending just 1%, which is pretty much what Germany actually is spending now. So is there the potential, Chris Parry, in your view, for a pretty major bust-up in Brussels on July the 11th?
Yes, there is. I'm afraid to say that if President, he'd like to be president, I guess, Juncker actually stumps up with 1%, and that's the way Europe wants to go, we're going to have a motto of can't fight, won't fight. Because Europe at the moment cannot take on the threats that are coming around the world from potential opponents without the top cover of the United States. There's no question. Even our military capability, except at the nuclear level, is woefully inadequate in relation to some of the potential opponents that are likely to come down track in the future. And I'm afraid we're in denial in that respect. And the other thing is, and I'm quite close to the American establishment on this, in future, the only people who are going to count with the Americans under this administration are those who come with high-end, hard capability. They're fed up with being told by Germany and others that, yeah, we'll contribute to peace support. They want hard-edge capability that can stand in the fight to deter coercion and deter potential opponents.
Now, we claim at the moment to be spending 2% on defence, but I'm told we've actually dragged into that all sorts of other parts of the security budget.
Yep, we are creatively accounting as always, and I would say we're spending probably about 1.6, 1.7%.
Wow.
So it's not really good enough, is it? But the real problem is that we're not allocating that budget on a strategic basis. We're replacing equipment with what I call legacy systems. We don't look beyond the next election in terms of strategic overview. And bear in mind that it takes anything between 10 and 15 years to procure equipment. You can't do it on that basis. So we've got to find a way of getting a good strategic view of what we require as global Britain, while ignoring the electoral pressures that all politicians seem to
always
be driven
face.
by.
And help us, Chris, with one thing. A phrase that gets bandied around a lot, and I'm sure people have read it and heard it, is Tier 1 capability. Can you just define exactly what that means?
Well, I wish I could, Nigel, because it seems to expand and contract depending on what context is being used.
Okay.
The previous expression was Premier League. Well, I have to tell you, you can be in the Premier League and still be pretty useless, because if you're at the bottom of the Premier League rather than at the top amongst the Man Cities and Arsenals, if you're down amongst the dead men, you're not actually that good either. The fact of life is, you've got to be good enough to be able to get respect in the world, to promote your interests, to defend your country, and also to deter coercion. And that means deterring Russia and China right now. And I have to tell you that our current armed forces are benchmarked against fighting people like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and Islamic State. And that takes you down to a pretty low level.
You made a comment earlier about what the Americans want and why what the Germans say is not good enough. And I increasingly get the feeling that this American administration is beginning to take this country less seriously on a whole raft of issues, including our military will. Where is our standing now? How does the world look at us right now?
Well, I think we've got a residue of respect, and we've got a residue of I think, regard for our armed forces. Our people are still very good indeed. It's just the systems, the platforms, and all the other things that we're putting into the fight aren't up to it. We've degraded them, I'm afraid, because we've had this 20-year aberration in the Middle East. If you go back to the 1998 Strategic Defence Review, if that had been resourced properly, we'd actually have pretty good military. And, by the way, it said we shouldn't get involved in things like Afghanistan and Iraq. So strategically, it was pretty good. Now, I think we are hanging on by our fingertips right now. There are reasons why the Trump administration doesn't have a special relationship with us. Part of it's personal, and I think you've dealt with that in the past. Secondly, when you've got a vociferous minority saying he's not welcome here, he will obviously go with people who like him and actually appreciate that he's trying to do something for the world. And I'm one of those people that believes that the world is a lot safer under Trump than it was under Obama. There's no question about that. You know, I speak to Russians and Chinese at conferences. They don't know how to play this president.
Yeah, they're not sure, are they?
They perceive him to be unpredictable. They could play Obama, they could play Clinton, even Bush, but they can't play this guy. And actually, his perceived unpredictability is a strategic asset for America and the West.
No, very interesting. And finally, Chris, is it your feeling? Do you think the British public take on board the arguments you're making about defence, about security, about all the modern threats, cyber, etc., that we face? Do you think this issue matters, or do you think inevitably we're going to go on running down our armed forces?
Until it becomes an electoral issue, Nigel, we'll keep running it down. As long as there aren't votes in defence, then it's going to continue. And we'll continue to rely on the Americans past the point where they will be prepared to help us. And we'll continue to rely on our nuclear deterrent. That's the thing. But the fact of life is the Americans have moved their posture, and it's a very subtle one. In the past, what they used to do is put together a posse. You and I would call it a coalition. They'd be the sheriff, and we'd all come along. What they're saying now is, you sort out your problems in your region, whether it's Europe or the Asia. Okay, we're not going to put together a coalition for you because you've been freeloading in the past. But what we will do, if it suits us, is we'll send the cavalry, maybe.
Maybe.
And that's why we need to build up our own defence, our own security, not rely too much on the Americans, see them as partners rather than godfathers.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. That was Rear Admiral Chris Parry passionately making the case that defence should matter, that we have a residue of respect around the world, but it's not much more than that. What does Jim in Richmond make of what the Rear Admiral just said?
Morning, Nigel.
Good morning.
Right, well, most of what Chris Parry has just said, vast majority, I completely agree with, and a lot of it said not so eloquently in a letter to my MP the day that Trump was elected.
Yeah.
And basically, I said, we need to wake up because the world is becoming a vastly different place. America is becoming a vastly different place. Trump is certainly a vastly different person. You and I have completely opposing views on Mr. Trump. He does have his qualities. I don't dispute, and anybody that takes him for a football.
Yeah.
I do beg your pardon.
That's all right. I know where you're going with that, yeah.
Anybody that takes him for a fool is seriously underestimating him, and very, very dangerously so. My personal view is that the thing that I object to most about him is the language that he uses and the way that he speaks, and that's between you, me, and the gatepost. Nigel, I was rude last time I spoke to you, and I apologise for that. I respect an awful lot of your views, but a lot I very strongly disagree with. And
well,
most
Jim,
all I oppose to is...
Jim, that's what LBC is for. LBC is for people to have strongly opposing views and to express them vigorously, but within certain rules.
I know that, like me, Nigel, you are big enough and ugly enough to take the rudeness, but it doesn't mean that it's right. But anyhow,
Jim, come to the point. Come to the point. Do you think, Jim?
Changing place. Yeah, I'm coming to the point.
Yeah.
Right. I personally believe that Europe is going to come under. The world is going through fantastic, huge changes over the next few years, unprecedented in our lifetime. America, we don't know where it's going, but it's changing hugely. Europe, I think, the European Union is going to look completely different if it survives the next 4 or 5 years. And I think it could well fragment. Now,
I think it will.
Your defence forces, you can't suddenly, upgrade them overnight. It takes years. So we need to be spending today for the world as it's going to be in 4 or 5 years' time. What's going to happen in Italy? What's going to happen in Germany? What's going to happen in France? What's going to happen in Holland? We need to be.
And Jim, what's going to happen with ISIS? What's going to happen with things we can't even see or understand? Jim, I'm going to have to end it there, but thank you for that little apology. And interesting, Jim and I, different views entirely on Trump and other things, but it's pretty important that we stay as a major military player in the world. And I really believe that. But if you think that's wrong, you don't think defence is a waste of money, come and tell me. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC, and it's now 11:17. Does defence matter? Are we cheating on the budget when we claim to be spending 2% per annum, the NATO minimum? Should we be planning to be a major Tier 1 player, Premier League player in the years to come, gaining the respect of America and perhaps much of the rest of the world? Or is it all out of date and hopeless and useless and a complete waste of time and money? But before I get back to that, there are elections today taking place in Mexico. And as you can imagine, every single candidate is anti-President Trump and anti the border policies. But the favourite that's come through is the leftist Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who perhaps not surprisingly is known as AMLO, because otherwise it really is a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? And he's campaigning on an anti-corruption ticket to bring change to Mexico and a big, hard left-wing interventionist economic policy. He's a friend of Jeremy Corbyn's. It's quite funny, though. Even though he is fiercely opposed to President Trump. Actually, in some ways, he looks a bit like a potential Mexican President Trump. So let's see what happens in those elections. And just think about this. And I know that there's been a lot of unpleasantness in this country during and since the Brexit referendum. Horrible things being said all round, particularly on the internet. But compare and contrast with this, that more than 130 candidates and political party workers have been killed since campaigning began in September. So it's pretty unpleasant here, but boy, it really is very grim indeed in Mexico. Back to defence, and Mike in Manchester is not that impressed with retired Rear Admiral Chris Parry. He says nothing much will change if only retired admirals, generals and air marshals spout off. Well, yeah, Mike, of course you're going to get people whose whole life has been part of the armed forces, believing in the armed forces and wanting them to be good. Of course you are. And of course, through history, they will oppose cuts, etc. But I think the point we're at here is the NATO alliance, is literally surviving on the edge of a precipice because the Europeans won't spend the money and because, frankly, my belief is Mr. Juncker is encouraging them to form a European army because he'd love to see the Americans out of Europe completely. That is my view, and please, if you think I'm wrong, come on and challenge me on that. But either way, we, in terms of our standing in the world, are beginning to slide. There is residual respect for who we are, but frankly, unless we do something, it won't be any more than that. So I think it does matter. I'm asking you, does it matter to you as voting members of the public? Caroline asks the question, and Caroline asks a fair question because, the Defence Secretary wants another 20 billion for defence over the next few years. And, of course, health has been promised 20 billion. And she says, what is the reason behind the continued depletion of our armed forces? Where does the money taken from our armed forces go? What is the taken money now funding? Money isn't taken, Caroline, just that budgets don't increase in line with inflation. That's generally how government cuts on spending or reductions come. And this idea, and it keeps coming back, whether it's health or defence or education, if you pay a penny more tax, there's more money for this. It's all absolute codswallop. The way that it works is we pay our taxes, and whether that's through income tax, whether it is through corporation tax, whether it is through the outrageous taxes on cigarettes and petrol and beer, but we pay our money and it all goes into a central pot and it's then allocated out from there. And the point, Caroline, about defence is we've got back, having been way below it during David Cameron's time, we've got back to this 2% figure. But the truth, as the Rear Admiral told us, is that actually we're cheating and we're adding things into that budget that aren't genuine. And all the while, our Army, Navy and Air Force are genuinely being depleted. I find it extraordinary, that we had 60 warships in 1982 at the time of the Falklands War and that we now only have 19. If anything was to happen to a place like the Falklands again, we would be completely incapable, not just with the size of the Navy, but with the merchant Navy as well. We would be completely incapable of mounting that operation ever again. Now, you may not think, folks, that matters. I happen to think that it does. John is calling from Radlett in Hertfordshire. Good morning, John.
Hello, Nigel.
So does this issue matter, John?
Absolutely. We have actually met for about a minute in Chatham House several years ago when I asked you at that time what your policy was for your party, and you said 3%, if I recollect the conversation.
Yeah.
I don't think that's enough. I've been campaigning for some considerable time for 6%. The position is this: I'm 80 years of age. I lived through the Second World War. My father was involved in the services in the Second World War, and I know what it's like to fear the threat of subjugation or annihilation. And this seems to have disappeared from the current psyche of the population. This country is painfully weak. We're much weaker than we were in August 1914 or September 1939 vis-a-vis our enemies. People don't realise that the Chamberlain government, much maligned, was spending over half its budget in June 1939 on defence, and thank God it did, because we would certainly not have won the Battle of Britain and be here today if they hadn't done so.
But earlier on, John, going back to sort of 1933, when Churchill and some others were urging increased defence spending because the Germans were cheating on the Treaty of Versailles provisions, government was very slow to wake up then, wasn't it?
Well, they were, but then if you look at the study history, and I studied history since a schoolboy 65 years ago, you find that the general public were against rearmament. The government, Chamberlain government, actually, to its credit, had to do rearmament using subterfuge. And in fact, if you look in the Americas as well, right up to Pearl Harbor, the American population were anti-war. And of course, that got Roosevelt re-elected. And if you remember, he didn't declare war on Germany. Germany declared war on him.
John, your point is interesting, that you lived through World War II and you understand what the fear of subjugation is. Of course, the threats have changed a bit in some ways, that obviously there's things like cyber warfare that are potentially very, very, could be very damaging to the modern economy. But John, what needs to be done to make the broader population understand why this matters?
Fright is I'm afraid, is the only answer, because they don't see. You see, most people just don't take any interest in defence until it's too late. I remember a certain very famous left-wing politician, Michael Foot,
yes,
who'd always campaigned against spending. Suddenly, I remember vividly him having a documentary, I think something to do with the wars in the Balkans, suddenly saying we should be in there doing this and that. And of course, it was wholly impossible because of the fact that the British Armed Forces had been so reduced in their code.
Well, maybe, John, Donald Trump coming on the 11th of July to this NATO summit, and if he's as straightforward in his analysis as I have quite good reason to think that he will be, maybe, John, that will frighten people into realising we can't take the Americans for granted any longer. We've got to start doing our bit. John, great phone call. Thank you. And maybe that's right. Maybe John is right. Maybe we do need to fear the threats ahead. Maybe the Americans have actually done too much for us in military terms, for the whole of Europe since 1945. Maybe we've all taken them for granted. Maybe that's going to change on July the 11th, and suddenly defence will start to become a bigger issue in British politics. I think that is what is going to happen. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, and it's now 11:30. Well, Donald Trump is certainly raising the temperature of the whole debate about defence with this NATO summit happening on July the 11th, and unless the Europeans start paying, the Americans may not be there to protect us anymore, and I think this issue does matter. I'm asking you whether you care about it. Now, talking of the raising of the temperatures, I remember, I'm old enough, the Sun front page in 1976, when it was hot for day after day, or it seemed like week after week. Phew, what a scorcher. I mean, great Sun headline. And yesterday, I watched a few overs of cricket yesterday afternoon, and the outfield looked just as it had looked back in 1976. So earlier on this year, when we were experiencing the beast from the east and that horrendous easterly winds and snow, I did ask legendary weatherman John Ketley whether it would be a barbecue summer. John, is this 1976 all over again?
Well, Nigel, good morning to you.
Good morning.
I think I also said when we spoke that I thought that come Wimbledon fortnight we'd be seeing some heat wave conditions then as well.
No, you did. Listen, you're on form. And
I'm on fire.
And if you've got some, well, we'll come to that in a second.
Yes.
And by the way, any horse racing tips, let me know after them. Don't tell everybody, for goodness sake.
No.
You ruin the prices.
Yeah.
But I mean, is this 1976 all over again?
Well, it's showing good signs of it, isn't it? But we mustn't forget that we have seen what you might call mini heat waves in the interim, the last 42 years as well. We go back to 2006, for example. That was a very, very hot July, and August 2003 was a record-breaking heat wave as well. It was actually confirmed as a proper heat wave because it lasted for 10 days or so, and it resulted in 2,000 deaths in Britain alone. So that was a proper heat wave, even though there isn't really strictly any suggestion of being a definition for a heat wave. But of course these days there is a heat wave plan in force. It's created by the Public Health of England and in association with the Met Office. So these organisations do put things together and start issuing warnings for the infirmed and such like things as that when it gets
And is
very
this,
hot.
John, to do with the number of consecutive days that it's over 30 degrees centigrade?
Well, it is really. I mean, people won't see that written down as such, but it is what it's all about. If it gets more and more humid as well, which it is starting to do now, because we are now kicking in the thunderstorms out of France, and it's been a really wet morning down across the English Riviera, down through Torquay, etc. When it starts to get more humid, which it is doing, as I say, and the temperatures keep on soaring 28 to 30 degrees or so, then this is more likely to produce these heat wave conditions and, a danger to life, really.
Now, big high pressure stuck over the United Kingdom and likely to be there for...
I think it's going to be there all week, certainly, and into next weekend for many of us. You've got to remember that so far, this last few days, last fortnight really, the hottest weather has actually occurred on the western side of Wales and up into parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland has had virtually record-breaking heat during the last week of June. England hasn't seen the high temperatures of that, but I think now we are starting to see these higher temperatures and triggering these thunderstorms as well.
And up through that western side, of course, of England, we've seen the Saddleworth Moor fires. We've now got a couple of quite big fires outside Bolton. I can remember in '76 seeing Keston Common quite near us in Kent burning, and remember that vividly. Put these fires that are happening into some sort of context. Are these big scale for England?
Well, it's a bit of a repetition of what happened in '76, which you referred to. I do remember in '76 there were fires going off every day, it seemed, and the fire brigade were working day and night trying to put out the fires in the peat and the sandy soils of Surrey and places like that, and they thought they'd put it out, and it came shooting back again the following day as the wind picked up. So there were very serious conditions back in '76. We do remember that extremely well. But I might just mention 20 years ago, 1995 and '96, Northern England, where these moorland fires are going on at the moment, they suffered very badly at that time because there were proper drought conditions. Again, it's very difficult to confirm a definition of drought, but they were really dry conditions for a couple of years in the north of England in particular, so not surprisingly there were lots of forest fires then, or moorland fires, and the reservoirs were down at 15% capacity, which seems amazing really in the South Pennines around West Yorkshire. So very dry conditions have been seen before. Hot conditions and forest fires and moorland fires are not that rare in this country, but at the moment there are signs that it is going to become quite serious this week.
Yeah, and you mentioned reservoirs. I see a photograph of Buell Reservoir in Lamberhurst in Kent, and that at the moment is less than 40% full.
Right.
And I think Northern Ireland, which you mentioned earlier, record heat, they've put a hosepipe ban in place already. Now, the winter to me seemed to be endless. It just rained and rained and rained. Are we heading for hosepipe bans quite widely?
Well, it wouldn't be my decision, obviously.
No, but your view.
And they'll probably come to you first anyway, Nigel.
Oh, well, fair enough.
But we can confer over a meeting or a pint or something. No, I mean, the way things are going, there isn't any sign of a big breakdown in this weather, so you've got to think that people are going to be watching this very seriously. The water authorities will be looking at this, and I'm sure we're a long way away from sharing a bath as we were 42 years ago and all that kind of thing, but, they are going to start putting out these bans and stop washing your car with a hose pipe and all the rest of it. Just one bucket might do. So it is getting quite serious at the moment, and it may well get worse before it gets better. And these storms in the southwest, of course, are going to become a little bit more extensive today, so that's another danger. And it is a danger because when you get lightning storms, then people do have to take care they don't go out on a golf course with your 3-iron, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Well, John, I have to say, you did say Wimbledon fortnight was going to be very hot and sunny. You are absolutely on form, on fire, as you say. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Pleasure.
Come and see us again soon. Well, you've got to hand it to John Catley. I mean, he's made a couple of big calls on this Sunday show this year. He predicted the mini beast over Easter when we all thought, gosh, there can't be any more snow this year. And he did say Wimbledon fortnight was going to be absolutely boiling and great weather. And this first week most certainly is. And I think, isn't it funny? But actually, I bet there's more conversations happened between families and partners this morning than on any other single subject. Let's get back to the serious issue of defence. Does it matter, or are we right just to run down our armed forces and to think that the conventional threats that we faced, frankly, won't be the same kind of threats we're going to face in the future? And many do think that. Many also, of course, think that Trident swallows up just too much of our defence budget. Alex is calling from Edinburgh. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning, Nigel. I used to be of the opinion, up until quite recently actually, that we should spend considerably more on our armed forces. But I've been doing some thinking about this, and I think we should pretty much just keep spending largely in line where it is at the moment. And if you look at other European countries, such as Germany and Sweden, comparatively, they spend quite a bit less than us on defence. And
yeah.
I think generally they have a better quality of life. And there's been a lot of talk about us being a tier one military power. And to be honest, what does that actually mean? And is that going to have a positive impact on the lives of citizens in this country? And I don't think it is. And I think we've got...
Well, it's about being a major global player, Alex. It's about feeling that we're secure and we can't be threatened through whether it's older forms of warfare or modern warfare. I mean, Alex, isn't having a good military, good intelligence, all of those things, isn't that a bit like the feeling that you're well insured in case something goes wrong with your car, your house, or whatever it may be?
That's true, but I think the issue is that, for example, I don't think we're investing enough in cyber defence. And actually, as a country, we do need to have a long, hard look at ourselves and decide what we want to be. For example, is there a point in us having these aircraft carriers and an expeditionary force? Do those things actually contribute to the safety and security of the people living in Britain?
Do you know, in 1981, Alex, in 1981, there was a major naval review put forward by the Thatcher government, and an Ashford MP called Keith Speed resigned over it. As it turned out a year later, Keith Speed was right. We could not, if those naval cuts had gone through as proposed, have gone and defended the people on the Falkland Islands. Did that matter? Well, there were some that thought it was 8,000 miles away and who cares. But actually, in terms of who we were as a country, in terms of fighting for the principle of national self-determination, I think, in general, the people of this country felt better that we'd done it.
Well, the issue with the Falklands at the time is they were entirely undefended, whereas now there are actual, military assets down there, and they can be scaled up quite easily without the need for expensive aircraft carriers.
But the point I'm making, Alex, is that actually, you're asking, does having strong defences make us feel better about ourselves as a people? And I'm saying it does have the potential to.
If you look at Sweden, who has comparatively less military capability to us, they've recently been ranked as the most respected country in the world. They seem to be pretty positive about themselves. They are highly respected. They have a fantastic quality of life. Surely it's better we spend more of our money on positive things for the future in science, technology, good social care.
I understand, Alex. I understand the argument, but Sweden, of course, has enjoyed quite a considerable period of neutrality, something that we will never ever be able to do. But Alex, I understand there are competing demands on money, not least of which is the 20 billion promise that the Prime Minister has made for the National Health Service to keep in line, of course, with Boris's bus. I wonder how much solidarity there'll be between May and Boris when they all meet in this Agatha Christie setting of Chequers on Friday. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC, and it's now 11:45. Does defence matter? What is going to happen at the NATO summit that's coming up on the 11th of July? I have been trying, by the way, now for a year or two, to wake people up to the fact that Mr Juncker wants a European army. I clashed head-to-head with Nick Clegg on that LBC debate back in 2014 on this issue. I've argued for years we should wake up to this, because I think that what the European Union wants to do is get NATO off their soil. It is said, perhaps apocryphally, but back in 1966, when Lyndon Johnson turned up in Europe and he went to see Harold Wilson, he said, "We've got a special relationship, you must come and join us in Vietnam." And Wilson very correctly said no. Then off he went, Johnson, to the Elysee, where he met the President of France, de Gaulle, and the French had decided that they were going to leave NATO. And de Gaulle says to President Johnson, "I want all American troops off French soil," to which Johnson replies, "Does that include the dead ones?" Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but the point being that there has always been a considerable friction between countries at the centre of Europe and America over the relative size and strength of America's military. The British have always been, if you like, the broker in the middle. You know, we have been the broker between America and the rest of the NATO members, and we've done that and been able to do that as a nation with a really quite impressive military capability. I think we're very, very close to the point where our military capability becomes so weak where we're no longer able to play that role. Perhaps those who protest Trump's visit remember that he's a president who helps support their freedom to do so. Peter says, of course the public don't understand how important it is to have a good military and an independent nuclear deterrent. Trump is playing into the EU's hands. Interesting one, this. The EU wants to supersede NATO. The EU needs its own forces to become the superstate it wants, and NATO is in the way of that, says MB in Ruislip. Well, maybe Trump is playing into their hands. But no, actually he's not. What Trump will do, he'll wake up the electorates to what this means. I mean, I spoke in Prague on this subject last year, and I said to them, you know, if Russia really did become very aggressive and you feared that they would move westwards, who would you rather have defend you? Trump, the British and NATO, or Mr. Juncker and his European army? And I think the answer to that is pretty obvious, and I'm hoping what this NATO summit does is wake people up right across Europe. Andrew is calling from Southampton. Good morning, Andrew.
Oh, good morning, Mr. Farage. Thanks for getting me on. Yeah, that's interesting what you say about this NATO summit, because, of course, it'll be dynamite because, of course, it's the German-dominated superstate, which is the EU, which is really calling for an EU army. It's Ursula von der Leyen, the German defence minister, who almost singly is the one calling for an EU army.
Oh, yes, very much so.
Yes, but anyway, that wasn't my point. The point was that we were talking about aircraft carriers earlier.
Yes.
And the British aircraft carrier and Type 45 destroyers, the entire propulsion system for them is designed and manufactured by the French. And this is a disaster. This is why Britain needs to build up its electronics industry first, and then start spending on defence, as well. Because really, defence these days, I mean, you were talking about cybersecurity earlier.
Yes.
Defence these days is all about electronics. And really, you know, if you look at Britain these days, I mean, 90% of 16-plus-year-olds give up STEM subjects after 16 years old. And our numbers of people studying electronics is going down rapidly. And, this is key to defence, electronics. And then we can start building the motors and drives for these battleships ourselves.
Do you know, Andrew, I'd never, ever thought about that, but you're right. Actually, electronics are the key in many ways to all of this, aren't they?
Yes, they are, yes. Yeah, very much so. I mean, I'm involved with the Revive British Industry campaign, which centres on electronics. And, really, another thing is that we don't have in Britain any semiconductor fabricators anymore. So all the silicon chips and integrated circuits that we'd need for all of our missiles and everything, we'd struggle to make them. Whereas, of course, the Americans don't. They have fantastic facilities. So if we can stay hand in hand with the Americans, then we should be safe, you know.
Andrew, how do we encourage more 18-year-olds or 16-year-olds even to be inspired to studying STEM subjects beyond school?
Well, I think, first of all, you tell them how incredibly rewarding it is, but we also have to go into schools and tell the children what a terrible state the United Kingdom is in due to our involvement in the European Union. We haven't made any money out over 35 years. Our national debt, £2 trillion.
Well, I'm not sure many schools would allow that line to be put, but my experience is that quite a lot of the teaching profession think differently. But we have to find some inspiration. Andrew, great call. Electronics at the heart of everything, whether it's cybersecurity or having the correct systems for Type 45 vessels. Very, very good call. Great point. Darren says, if Corbyn becomes our PM, our army will consist of a box of toy soldiers and a slingshot. Well, actually, I did hear the Labour defence spokeswoman last week saying Labour are committed to defence, which of course I believe, as much as I believe Brexit means Brexit. Mike is a first-time caller from Bexhill down in Sussex. Good morning, Mike.
Nigel, good morning to you. Really nice to speak to you. It's been a long time.
Pleasure to have you on the show. So what are we going to do about defence, Mike? Does anybody in Bexhill care about defence?
Not at all. We're sleepy down here, I'm afraid, and we've all got grey hair down here, Nigel.
Right.
No youngsters down here, but mine is more about the money, Nigel, about the fact that, spending 47 billion a year, which equates really to, I think there's something like 30 million taxpayers in this country. It equates to something like £1,200 each per year per man and woman. Now, that is ridiculous money, Nigel, when we're all broke and we're all desperate to move on in this country and trying to get our Brexit out there to the world. And we're looked at out there like we're some sort of puppet of the USA and we're just wasting money unnecessarily.
Right. So, Mike, if you were very, very hard up, would you decide that you're not going to spend the money to have insurance on your house?
No, pretty well not. And of course, we all have to insure what we feel is right. But comes to a point where you're over-insured, Nigel. We are a little island to the western side of Europe. We are no danger to anybody. And yet we're provoking world wars in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. We put our forces out there for no reason.
But that's slightly different, Mike. And by the way, I was very opposed to the Iraq war and vehemently opposed to what happened in Libya. But the argument I've always made, Mike, is that actually having good military forces and good and exactly too on cybersecurity and also intelligence. The argument, Mike, is that it makes us a serious player in the world, and you never know what problem could be around the corner.
But we've got to find who the actual people are. Attackers, Nigel. Who are these people? Who are the dangers in the world these days? I can't see any.
Well, I hadn't heard of ISIS. I hadn't heard of ISIS 5 years ago, Mike.
Well, I think they were, again, ISIS is a long, long story, Nigel, as you know, if you look very deep into what ISIS are, what we're really about, but that would be another show, no doubt. But we've just got to look at how much money we're spending per capita.
No, and you think it's just too much, yeah?
Absolutely, and they want more, of course. That's the thing, they want more.
No, Mike, great call, thank you. Mike says it's over £1,000 for each taxpayer in this country, and it's just too much money. I look at it, as I say, like having insurance on the car, the house, or whatever it may be. Nigel, if we allow the EU to dictate our defence policy, then a federal Europe will take place, says Tom in Basingstoke. I remember, Tom, Verhofstadt, back in 2012, when we and the French were bombing Libya, because we wanted to get rid of Gaddafi, what good that did the region. And I remember Verhofstadt foaming at the mouth, saying, why are Britain and France bombing Libya? We want planes with European flags bombing Libya, because to Verhofstadt, that is the ultimate symbol of a nation state. It is the ability to go to war. And that's what they want. But they don't want to spend any money on it. And frankly, without the Americans and NATO, I don't think they're ever going to be taken too seriously. I've quickly got time for Peter in West Hampstead. Peter, good morning.
Hello, Nigel. I don't think it's a numbers game. It's a quality game.
Okay.
And we need the best and the fastest in reasonable numbers. But there is something, the RAF are missing a trick here. They could book a lot of their expenditure to the civilian world. And if you take the Saddleworth Moor fire, the RAF have 95% of what it's needed to fight forest fires. They've got the Hercules C-130s. But I have a feeling they don't have the insert, the MAFFS2 insert, to carry the water. And they're relatively cheap. Now, if they were to have these inserts, they could use them when this problem keeps cropping up. Grenfell would have been assisted by this equipment, and they could then book a lot of...
So they could basically put some of the spending off to civilian spending and off of their defence budget.
Exactly.
Smart idea. Peter, thank you. Last quick message. The weather dominating everything, of course. Nigel, I found the next big debate for your show. With the heat wave and drought set to continue, which politicians would your listeners be prepared to share a bath with? James, fantastic. Great idea. You've been listening to The Nigel Farrow Show. I'm back tomorrow night at 7 from Strasbourg. At 3 this afternoon, it's Andrew Castle. But up next, it's Majid Nawaz.
Thank you, Nigel.